Hello. We thank you for tuning in for this session of the Media Literacy Discussion Club. I'm Joe Crescente, Media Literacy Fellow. Please don't be a stranger. Let us know what you think about this program by liking it or leaving a comment. To join our other AMC online programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, check updates on our website, amc.ru, and follow us on social media to learn, connect, and produce together. All right, so this presentation is called Media Literacy, Why It's Important and How It Can Be Used to Build Other Forms of Knowledge, Part 1. I've never done a presentation that had Part 1, and obviously there's going to be a sequel, a second part to it. So changing the slide, why the parts, this presentation in Part 2. So I've been writing, I got invited to submit an article to an academic journal about, how to incorporate media literacy into other kinds of lessons, right? So for example, in particular, they wanted me to focus on, how to think about, language learning, foreign language learning, in particular, learning English and using media literacy as a new kind of tool to help people learn English. So, I had to write the article over the last week and a half, and I decided why not, I did all this new thinking, why not put it together and make a presentation out of it? And then I realized it's quite long, so I broke it down into 2 parts. So today we'll look at the first half. Next week we'll look at the second half of the ideas in this paper. And a lot of this, for those of you who went to my seminars, in particular last year at the American Center, some of this material might not be terribly new to you. But I think I'm looking at it in a slightly different way, trying to think about how could you use these concepts and offer some guidance, in an English language setting, in an English language classroom setting. So, at some level, I'm addressing this presentation to teachers, but as I explained here in this slide, right, this presentation is both a thorough introduction to media literacy, as well as a practical guide for teachers, in particular English language teachers, to help them think about incorporating these concepts into the classroom. All right, so moving ahead to the next slide. What is media literacy? I think that media literacy presents a great opportunity for teachers to incorporate media into the language classroom. And once again, if you're not a teacher, I think you're still going to get a lot out of this. So, it's kind of guided towards educators for sure, but it's really general. So 99.9% of the stuff will be applicable to anyone. And some of the exercise examples, these are certainly things you can do by yourself on an individual basis, right? But it is geared a little bit towards educators, right? And I think media literacy presents a great opportunity for teachers to incorporate media, something that sometimes instructors struggle with, into the language classroom in a bit of a different way than just playing a video and working on language and cultural skill building, because incorporating media literacy into the classroom compels students to use what they've learned about language and culture, but also develop critical thinking skills and reflect on their own media consumption and experiences, right? So you can use these exercises and look at US-based media or UK-based media, Australian, whatever, and build discussions out of that, and there's a lot of reading you can do and writing you can do and discussions that you can do in English. But you can also, apply some of this knowledge to your other life. It doesn't have to feel so separate. I think sometimes, like I've been learning Italian over the last year, and sometimes I feel like when I'm learning Italian, it's only applicable to when I'm talking to an Italian person, or maybe when I'll be in Italy, which who knows when that will happen again. But it feels separate from my normal life. It's like when I would step into, I would Skype with my instructor, when I would step into that zone, that Italian zone, it felt separate from the rest of my life. And I think one advantage of media literacy is there can be this connection between real life lived, skills that you can use in your everyday life, as well as language learning at the same time. Changing the slide. So the benefits of the language teacher are hopefully a more engaged classroom with students gaining proficiency in multiple layers of skills. So goals, the goals of this presentation, right? To define media literacy inside out in a very thorough way, to demonstrate its importance, and to offer real-life examples that can help educators incorporate these concepts into language learning classrooms. It's important, though, to remember, I think, and I've worked with or done some presentations and with some English language groups over the last year. And I think at first some instructors, they're all very, very open to it. But I think one thing I always tell them in the beginning is, like, you do not need to be a media specialist in any way, shape, or form to include these concepts, right? The fact is, you're already encountering all this stuff in your own lives, right? You're just using, you don't even have to necessarily do any research necessarily, although it helps sometimes to fill in some gaps. But the thing is, you're using social media, you're forwarding things, sharing things with other people, you're reading things already in your own lives. So actually, you don't need to be any kind of expert in this field in order to feel comfortable using this material in your classrooms. And I think a lot of times, I'll say this a couple times, even in this presentation, a lot of it is you're learning along with your students. So it's an interesting thing, right? You can actually be on the level with them and learn a lot from them. They can learn a lot from you, and it can present a new way to build a relationship and a rapport with your classroom. All right, going to the next slide. So the Aspen Media Literacy Leadership Institute came up with the following definition in 1992. The ability, media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in a variety of forms. 1992 is important because that's roughly a year or so around the very early stage of the internet and becoming more and more widespread. Basically, media literacy and the birth and growing up of the internet, they're hand in hand, right? Media literacy definitely exists as a concept, as a discipline, as a subject, probably because of the internet. Although I've never heard anybody explicitly state that if there's no internet, there's no media literacy. I think that it's just the media literacy that we know of today is very heavily connected with online and digital culture. Changing to the next slide. So the Center for Media Literacy defines a few principles that guide it as a practice, right? And we're going to go over each of them separately in a minute. Media literacy is a 21st century approach to education. Media literacy provides a framework to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and participate with messages in a variety of forms, from print to video to the internet. And media literacy builds an understanding of the role of media in society, as well as essential skills of inquiry and self-expression. All right, so let's unpack these definitions one by one, changing the slide again. So media literacy is a 21st century approach to education. A Russian journalism student who attended one of my seminars last year defined media literacy as the new lickbez. Lickbez being the Soviet-era campaigns in the 1930s to eliminate illiteracy among the wider population. Changing the slide. I've found this an excellent place to begin. For media literacy, in many ways, is trying to do what these earlier campaigns were attempting to achieve, right? It seeks to eradicate ignorance by using the everyday tools of modern life. And additionally, by demonstrating the connection to earlier forms of literacy, such as reading and writing, students will be able to see the continuation of literacy into new forms. This builds into point 2. Media literacy provides a framework to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and participate with messages in a variety of forms, from print to video to the internet. So some people, they look to me for answers, which I don't think is the most productive approach. I don't know how many times I have been asked in the last, say, year and a half, please write down, here's a notebook, write down the 5 sources I need. It doesn't work like that, right? I can't simply tell you this is a good source, this is a bad source, this is fake news, this is real news, and have it all decided like that so simply. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. Um, Many people changing the slide when they first encounter media literacy expect simple answers, right? But this isn't mathematics, right? There's no perfect answer to a complicated equation. Changing the slide again. And as instructors, you shouldn't feel pressure to know everything or feel the burden of being an expert, as I already mentioned, right? Media literacy is personal, and your approach should be personalized. I have found that I am just as much a student as I am a teacher. When I'm conducting a seminar, I'm learning something during every session I hold from the people assembled. And I think that should be true, right? Like I learn so much just by seeing how people interpret different concepts and so on and so forth. I would say at some point, probably a good chunk of the material that I use today on a regular basis has come about from having a discussion with people about media literacy, not just from like opening a book or looking at an article online. And even if it's not coming directly from discussions, it gave me an idea which led to another idea. So discussing media literacy leads to perhaps higher forms of literacy in media. Changing the next slide. In particular, figure out what knowledge your students lack or what they are interested in and go from there. And similarly, if you're just an individual who wants to become more media literate, figure out what you want and what you need and go from there, right? What do you need? Why media literacy? Why is that an important thing for you, right? Is it that you need good information about health stuff? All right. Well, just kind of focus on that. And from there, you'll build up some skills that you can apply to different areas, later on. Okay, moving forward. What media literacy does is it provides a framework for analysis, but you still, unfortunately or fortunately, have to do the analysis each and every time. I'll go over this again and again in this presentation, right? You can't, learn a language by just using a translate, like Google Translate or Yandex, et cetera, et cetera. You can't just use like some kind of app to learn a language, right? You still have to put in the time. Similarly, you can't just learn 3 chords and know how to play the guitar fully. You have to put in the time in order to build up the actual skills. These other tools can help you with some shortcuts, but shortcuts don't work so well. In media literacy, you'll just have a very kind of much like learning a foreign language. If you only know how to recognize a word on an app or something, or 3 chords on a guitar, it'll be pretty quick. It'll be fairly quickly. Others will, and you yourself will know that you haven't gained real mastery of this. Changing to the next slide. So media literacy requires you to be active. This goes hand in hand, as I'd mentioned with language learning. It's one thing to master grammar exercise in the textbook, but to truly gain fluency in the language requires an active approach to learning. As well as an acceptance, this is important, I think, that there are no boundaries and that you are never finished, right? I've been studying Italian a year. I still feel like a little child, and my language skills are at the level of a little child, so it's a fair analogy. But even with Russian, which I've been studying since 2001, I probably plateaued. I haven't, probably learned as much in the last, 5 years, say, as I did before. I fully recognize that the longer you study a language, the more you realize you're never going to learn every last word, probably, unless a native speaker from birth or something. And native speakers, you're never going to learn every last word, right? You should just have this idea that in your head, an acceptance that there are no boundaries and that you're never finished, right? And that's not to overwhelm you, but what it does is it just lets you know, that there's always room to improve. It's you could, and it depends on you. I think that's the most important thing, right? I plateaued in Russian probably because I got to a point where I was able to do everything I needed to do. I was able to get my points across. I was able to do, write emails, and a variety of other things, even at a higher level than that. And, I just didn't see the value, at my age to keep going, keep taking lessons. And I think, for media literacy as well, you put into it what you get out of it, what you put into it, just like any other thing you do in life. All right, changing the slide. Being media literate means being involved in the same way that the original definition intended, right? If the hope of the campaigns in the USSR was to get formerly illiterate peasants and workers to read, it was also to get them, writing letters, reports, and so on, right? So it wasn't just about one thing, here, read this. It was also about how can you use that knowledge and work with it, right? Changing to the next slide. Similarly, 21st century citizens actively participate in the creation and dissemination of messages, blogs, posts, movies, you name it, right? Your students should be aware of what they're doing and how it could be read and perceived. Changing to the next slide. Media is a part of our lives as never before. I think this is, probably can't argue against this. It's integrated into everything we do, from our studies to business, to our leisure time, to how we receive information, to how we interact, with our friends and relatives. Changing the slide. So I encourage everyone to be aware of what they're doing when they engage with social media, traditional media, when you share media with your audiences. And by audiences, I just mean, your base, your contact, your friends, whatever. Odnoklassniki, for those a little pastarsze. So today's world requires us to look for information as never before, but we can't just settle on the first piece of information that we find. Changing the slide again. We are explorers as never before, right? My father, who's going to be 80 years old in a few months, it's really incredible to me. Most of it, what's really incredible about it is he's really quite healthy and active and everything like that. He doesn't seem to be that, to be almost 80 years old, to be honest. Dad, if you're watching this, I'm saying this all as to demonstrate your stamina and your energy. But I think that, just what is possible as compared to something that stuff that my father, was able to do at my age, you can't even compare the two, right? You didn't have the possibility to know everything. There's pluses and minuses to that. I mean, I, as well as most people I know, get sidetracked a lot more often because the amount of knowledge and the things you can learn and the easy accessibility of that knowledge is, it's incomparable. It's so easy to find out practically anything, right? But largely, I do think it's positive, right? And so we explore and seek good information. Why? So we can, for the most part, I think it's so that we can make decisions that affect and impact our lives. And we do it all the time, whether we realize this or not. If you're an instructor looking for an activity, ask your students what they're interested in exploring and go on the adventure with them. Sounds a little cheesy, but what I mean by that is, I was teaching at the University of Massachusetts up until a year and a half ago. And, we would do an assignment where it asked students to create they had to do a small research paper. And I didn't even want them to do the research. I wanted them to find out what's out there. I just wanted them to find information sources say, and I would ask them to create a question, a research question. And I think a lot of 19-year-old students' instincts tell them, all right, I've got 5 classes, I'm really busy, I've got a social life, all this stuff, a lot of different things tugging them in different directions. And so their instincts were to get a research question that they could answer really quickly. Like, is the world flat? No, it is not. And, this is what 5 people have to say on it. I'm done. Good. I can move on to my other assignments. Now, those assignments would get a C, troika, they wouldn't do very well. I would encourage students to instead ask questions they didn't know the answers to, right? Think of it as an exploration, right? Think of it as, choose something you really want to know about that you don't know the answer to and research it, right? This is something you could easily do with your students in an English language classroom environment. And you get to learn a lot, and they get to learn a lot, and they're probably invested in it once they realize they're able, to do something, and they don't have to prove anything. They just have to be able to. The goal of the assignment isn't to prove something. It isn't to prove the world is flat per se. It is to maybe figure out what people have been saying about it over the last 100 years or something like that. You're just trying to find out what are the impacts of, and in this way, you're not just regurgitating information that you know already. You're doing an exploration. You're keeping an open mind. You're using your critical thinking skills to be able to find out more information on a topic, something we probably, on the whole, humans don't do as much as they could. So, changing the slide again. To remind you once again, right, the media does not operate in a binary, good news, bad news. Just as you can't put news articles into bins, this is fake news, this is real news, right? Everything is way more complicated than that, unfortunately. Most things are somewhere in between. Maybe closer to one of those poles than the other, but it's not so simple to just say this is good, this is bad. Changing the slide again, right? The media landscape, as I just suggested, which media landscape that we encounter every single day, it's extraordinarily, except for maybe those at their dacha where you don't have a good signal, you blessed people, and you could just read books or something. It's extraordinarily complex, right? The goal of media literacy, in my opinion, is to help people become comfortable with that complexity, learn to live in it and with it, and navigate it in a way that makes sense. I'm going to explain this a little bit. So be comfortable with the idea that, the world is complicated, media is complicated, messaging is complicated, it's so simple, and not become just cynical and just tune everything out. Because I think that's what a lot of people do once they realize how complicated they do one of two things. When people become too overwhelmed by media messages or the complexity, et cetera, or they can't figure out what's right and what's wrong, is that they either become very cynical or they start subscribing to some crazy theories, or conspiracy theories even, because they're in a world where there's no truth, it's a lot easier just to believe something simple that helps you put your mind at ease, so to speak. So I think personally that media literacy is all about being comfortable with that complexity, not getting overwhelmed by it. You learn to live with it. You learn to live with that complexity. You learn to see the nuance. You learn to keep an open mind and use it in a way that makes sense, right? It means that you're actually probably using the media more, but you've got the skills built up so that it becomes easier to use it, to navigate it. And you're using it in ways you realize what's priority for you with media and what is not. And so, therefore, you can use it in a useful, productive way for you rather than just swimming in this abyss of information that's so overwhelming. It's, makes you feel like you're on a sinking ship. Hope that makes sense. Changing the slide again. So, right, as I've mentioned, media literacy is personal. It should be each person's goal to figure out what you need, right? Maybe you need health information. Maybe you need information about, changing neighborhoods, right? Real estate. I mean, media literacy is not all about breaking news, right? I think it's really interesting, right, if you ever want to buy an apartment, to think about, all right, what are some choices I can trust about this, right? Because it's, one thing to listen to a real estate developer or agent about a neighborhood, but, they're going to give you one side of the story. You probably need some other sides of the story. So how do you navigate that kind of stuff? How do you figure out what are good sources, Probably the best thing in a lot of situations is keep a wide variety of sources. Don't believe the first thing that makes sense to you, don't just read the first thing that is the answer you want. Right? I think the easiest thing, say, if you're looking for an apartment, let's say you want to get an apartment in this neighborhood, real estate agent they're there to tell you exactly what you want to hear so that you buy something, for them, and they get a great commission. And it's a job just like a lot of other jobs, but you should be there with counter information so that you have a full picture of what is going on, right? And as a media literate person, you'd instantly be aware that you need 3 or 4 different kinds of sources. Maybe you need some information about the neighborhood, so you read up on the history of that. Maybe some local news outlets do that. Read up on what's going on, what are some developments there, right? Read up on the potential for the neighborhood, et cetera, as well as get information from developers and the agents, and maybe government. There's some government resources you could look at that can help you make an informed decision, because media literacy is about helping you make informed decisions, and it doesn't all have to do just with breaking news. It's definitely not all about coronavirus, even though for better or worse, that's what it seems like. It's consumed us completely in the last, I don't even know when it began anymore, like 4 or 5 months. So as individual media consumers, we must create criteria for ourselves to analyze it. Changing the slide again. And as teachers, you can encourage students to examine, for example, their personal media consumption habits in the form of a diary, right? This is a great writing practice that can be applicable to personal and professional contexts, right? Again, using media literacy to teach English, but also to help build skills that are applicable outside the classroom. The student really feels like they're getting a lot out of something. And after discussing what they have learned about themselves, ask them in writing or discussion, how their understanding of the concepts has changed, since you first introduced them. Changing the slide again. So once again, why media literacy? In today's world, messages and relationships are often transmitted through the media, in particular through the news media and social media. And have influence today, you often must engage the media to get your point of view out there. Standing in place to people one at a time is often not enough to have an impact in today's fast-paced world. Changing a slide. Whether we like it or not, when we forward an email, write an original social media post, or share someone else's, we're participating in the media that makes this world go round, right? It is no longer the impenetrable bastion of very large organizations like the Associated Press and TASS and Reuters and so on and so forth, New York Times, right? Media is, in some ways it's become more consolidated, but in some ways it's become much more, for lack of a better term, available to people. Anybody can get involved in it. And as we are now personally involved, we have an obligation to be responsible for the information we produce and share. Once again, this is not a time for ignorance, right? I firmly believe, a lot of people don't firmly believe this, but I firmly believe that when you share something, you have anytime you share something, you have potential for impact. Meaning, you could share something, it could convince somebody to take action or learn. Usually it's just learn a bit more, et cetera, et cetera. But I use that to encourage people to think ahead. What it is that you're sharing. You should be responsible for that level of information. You should share good information, because sharing something that's not 100% true, that you might think is funny, could have unintended consequences. And I just try to think about that every time I share something, and I definitely do not share nearly as much as I used to. What is it I'm sharing? What is the impact of this? Is it just to get a thought off my head, or is it so that I want to share something I've learned about? Do I want to bring attention to something, an article, or so on? Just it's part of kind of like that diary of media consumption habits, right? One way you could formulate this with a student is say, all right, track all your social media posts for, I don't know, a week. and write it down. Write down what you were thinking at the moment you were sending it. And then go back maybe at the end of that week and look at the, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 posts you made and say, what could some stranger, interpret from this, or something like that. It's one way you could analyze it, and that'll help students. First off, think about what they're doing, and then think about how it could be potentially perceived by someone else. Or you could have a student write down their 5 or 10 social media posts that they make, and then have another student, for example, say, this is what I interpret when I see this post, and that's a way that, you're building, group building, maybe some dialogue, could have some interesting conversation about that for sure. All right, changing the slide. Various studies suggest, I found many, that the average American, so it depends, there's a wide variety of numbers, but generally the average American spends somewhere between 6 and 11 hours per day consuming some form of media. That's social media, email, television, movies, music, etc. A lot of different things, right? Think about it. When you're at work, let's say you're in front of a computer 7, 8 hours. That's already eating up quite a decent chunk of that. Even if you're taking, having some meetings or something, and if you're on the metro between work. I'm imagining a world that existed 5, 6 months ago, when people could move around a little more easily and went to workplaces and such. But maybe 40 minutes on the way to work, you're listening to something, a podcast, or watching something. Even 40 minutes, and then you watch another hour or something when you get home. It's easy to see how this is applicable, probably to not just Americans, but people in Russia and around the world. Since it's taking up so much of our time, I think it's really important to be conscious of its impact and influence, as I was suggesting just a minute ago. So continuing with the why part, what is the purpose of media literacy? Changing the slide again. So the National Association for Media Literacy Education, NAMLE, states that the, quote, purpose of media literacy education is to help individuals of all ages develop the habits of inquiry and skills of expression that they need to be critical thinkers, effective communicators, and active citizens in today's world. Changing the slide, right? The media today is a business, right? It operates in 2020, not according to some outdated models. Traditional media is in competition with social media, Facebook, Twitter, Contact, Instagram. It doesn't exist in a silo all by itself, right? All forms of media are trying to get the attention of the same sets of eyes and ears as anybody else, right? Changing the slide. So NAMLE goes through and outlines some of its core principles for media literacy education, of which I'll share some of those with you now. So number one, changing the slide, media literacy requires active inquiry and critical thinking about the messages we receive and create, right? I think we've already gone over this. The next point, right? Media literacy builds and reinforces skills for learners of all ages. Like print literacy, those skills necessitate integrated, interactive, and repeated practice. I think this is really important, right? Media literacy is not just for the young. It's for everyone, right? All generations have a stake in building a media literate society. Additionally, as it suggests here, media literacy is a skill set that you can integrate into your daily practices and strengthen through repeated practice. You can get better at reading by doing it repeatedly. You can become a better guitar player by practicing every day. You can gain fluency in a foreign language due to repeated exposure. Changing the slide again. Same is true with media literacy, right? This is something that's interesting to think about when putting together a curriculum, right? If you're a teacher. How can you, in the course of study, improve language as well as an additional skill at the same time, right? Knowledge is a process of acquisition, after all. Changing the slide again. So the more that the lessons of media literacy become a part of your students' regular habits, the easier it will become for them to spot misleading headlines, questionable sources, and inaccurate information. It will become second nature, and this will help them become more savvy language learners and global citizens. Changing the slide again. So media literacy develops informed, reflective, and engaged participants, essential for society. It's no exaggeration to say that a healthy functioning society of the future will depend on its people being informed and engaged. In other words, able to stop falsehoods and conspiracy theories spinning out of control. Changing the slide. Media literacy recognizes that media are part of culture and function as agents of socialization, and affirms that people use their individual skills, beliefs, and experiences to construct their own meanings from media messages. So I say this all the time to people who ask, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, I've had this happen. Please write down the top 5, sources I can look at, and then I'll be done with this. It doesn't work that way, right? There is no one right media, right? Media is a product of a culture, and cultures are informed by a point of view related to its history, its past experiences, and its development. And this is okay. This is profoundly okay. Changing the slide again. This is, of course, very different. Wait, I'm sorry. I skipped ahead by accident. Hold on. Each media outlet has a point of view. It is an owner. We're an ownership team. It builds up its own culture. It becomes known for certain things, right? It sees things in a certain way, through a certain lens. It's normal for a media outlet in one country to emphasize a story in a certain way, while a media outlet in another country see things a different way. It doesn't necessarily mean that one is right and one is wrong. It's possible that both are right, even if the information varies slightly, but it's up to you to figure things out for yourself, right? If you take a look at, a variety of, US-based websites, they all have an audience. Everybody has an audience, and publications speak to that audience, right? It shouldn't be surprising, that a television program clearly has an audience. Why wouldn't a media publication, right? And they take all sorts of things into consideration, right? If you look at the advertising, you can often tell a lot, right? You look at New York Times advertising, any of the real estate advertising in the New York Times is going to be for apartments that are $1 million or more, right? So what does that suggest? It suggests that the general audience of the New York Times, I assume they've done decent market research, or at least their assumption is somebody who is quite wealthy, or somebody who's at least upper middle class, or somebody who at least wants to get there. That can tell you something about it, right? A certain level of education based on the language that's used, and so on and so forth. Each media outlet has its own things. Try to figure out a useful exercise always, and one you can use with your students is, give them a publication. Say, all right, what do you think this audience is, based on everything you can see, based on the advertising, based on the kinds of articles they write about. Try to describe who their target audience is. That's a great exercise that gets students thinking. Maybe can introduce them to some new publications, and so on. Changing the slide. But this obviously is not the answer most people want to hear, right? Most people want, at least before they think about why is media literacy important, they want easy answers. They want a solution to the equation, right? But this is exactly where a person hoping to gain proficiency in media literacy comes in, right? If one can figure out who owns the source, what their bias might be, what the publication might be known for, you can start to make objective assessments as to what accent is being made on the particular news story, right? So then, rather than dismissing a story as being simply inaccurate, you can try to see the story through the particular cultural and media lens that the story is being reported. This is, of course, something that's quite different than there being no such thing as truth, right? There's this this term called post-truth era, right? I've heard it in Russian, post-pravdy as well. So this idea of the post-truth era has come about in recent years to describe a situation where there's this sense that there's no longer a shared sense of truth. But personally, I believe in truth. I do believe it exists. But the situations I outlined above describe, maybe different ways of seeing facts, but in a manner that does not dispute the core facts of whatever is being reported. This is the end of part one of the two-part presentation. We'll get to the part two next week. I believe the presentation will be on Wednesday, so changing week to week the different days of the presentation. But for now, we'll stop, and I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take any questions you may have. Or comments. All right, got a question from Misha Holy J. Do you believe in independent media? I mean, it's not necessarily that, independent media is good and all other kinds of media are bad. There's plenty of good examples of state-financed media around the world. I don't think that independent media is necessary. I mean, there's plenty of bad independent media too. I believe in having the ability to have a good wide range of sources of information. So, whether that's a mix of independent media, big traditional, kind of conglomerate-owned media such as the New York Times, as well as maybe, some of the wire services, which basically a wire service such as Associated Press or Reuters, or I think even TASS qualifies as one as well, right? You have journalists around the world, who might work for several wire services. They provide articles, but they tend to be pretty straightforward kinds of things. As well as, occasionally there's some good state media in different places that's worth. I think the combination of having, plus social media as well is a form of media that I use and that journalists use all the time these days. I think having a good mix of those five resources together can give you a pretty decent idea about what's going on in the world, right? So the media landscape, as I suggested in this presentation, is much more complicated, certainly than it used to be, and that can overwhelm people. But at the same time, I think we have the ability, if we have the time, to figure things out at a much greater level, to get a really good sense of what's going on the ground. And that can be quite useful. I think that, looking back, right, all these different things, having mix of independent, state, private, conglomerate type, wire service and social media really helped us see and understand the coronavirus in a way that just wouldn't have been able to cover something maybe 20 years ago. And Misha Holy J also says, thanks for the presentation, by the way. Thank you for listening. Got a comment from Anastasia Korova. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening, Anastasia. All right. So as I suggested, right, this is a two-part presentation. So I encourage you to tune in next week to listen to the second part. Okay, another quick comment from Misha. Yeah, but it's quite hard to handle all this information from different sources every day. True, which is why I would encourage people to get a good mix, but a few sources and get to know them really well, right? Choose 2-3 categories. I usually use Twitter, for example, just to learn what's really happening right now, and then I go to a couple different sources to see what they have to say about it. So get to know 2-3 sources. Maybe one independent, could be one private, one state. It's up to you. Find 2 or 3 sources you like. Find good. You find do good quality journalism, and then you have them in your back pocket, so that when you do hear of something, get to know these sources really well. And then when something does come up, you have a friend to turn to, so to speak, that you can trust. I mean, still always keep your skepticism, radar up and running, because especially in breaking news stories, people can get journalists, they're humans and they might not get everything 100% right, but having a few personally trusted sources, and that's not me telling you, look at this source, look at this source. This is you reading for 6 months to a year and really saying, I understand this publication. I know their audiences. I know their weak spots. I know their strengths. I just like a friend. I know them really well, so that in a time of where there's breaking news or some big world event that's going on, you have somebody to turn to that you already know quite well. I think that can help you, not feel so overwhelmed by information from all these different sources every day. All right. Thank you to everybody for listening. Once again, right? This is part one of a two-part presentation. So next week, we will continue with this in this direction on this theme. So once again, we thank you for tuning in to this session of the Media Literacy Discussion Club. Please don't be a stranger. Let us know what you thought about this program by liking it or leaving a comment. To join our other AMC online programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, check updates on our website, amc.ru, and follow us on social media to learn, connect, and produce together. Have a good evening.